I should have known better than to sign up for this voyage. Sitting here now, listening to the groan of the ice pressing in on us, it feels like I signed a pact with something much darker than the Kriegsmarine. My name is Friedrich Müller, and if anyone ever finds this journal, know that I'm writing it as much for myself as for you. Maybe it'll keep me sane, or maybe it'll serve as a warning. Either way, there isn't much else to do while we're stuck under this damned ice. It started as a routine patrol in the Arctic. Our U-boat, U-612, was assigned to disrupt Allied supply routes near the polar regions. We were supposed to be in and out, a quick mission. Captain Dietrich assured us it would be straightforward. He even joked about it. "Think of it as a holiday," he said. "We'll be back before you miss the taste of warm bread." I laughed with the rest of the crew, but now, as I'm scribbling this, I can't help but feel like those words cursed us. The first few days went as planned. The Arctic was a strange beauty, vast and silent, with sheets of ice stretching to the horizon. The water was so clear that you could see shadows of fish swimming below. It was cold, yes, but the heaters worked, and the men's spirits were high. We had a rhythm, watch shifts, engine checks, and the occasional card game to pass the time. Even the gruff old mechanic, Kaiser, cracked a smile once or twice. Then, the ice came. It started with a storm. The waves rose higher than we'd ever seen, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. We dove deep to avoid the worst of it, but when we surfaced, we found ourselves surrounded by pack ice. Massive sheets of frozen water trapped us like flies in amber. Captain Dietrich tried to maneuver us out, but the more we pushed, the worse it got. The ice seemed to close in like it was alive. "How's it looking, Dietrich?" Our first officer, Victor, asked that first day. His voice was steady, but his eyes darted to the portholes. "We'll break through," the captain replied, though his tone wasn't as confident as his words. "It's just ice." It wasn't just ice. The first sign of trouble came 2 nights later. I was on watch duty, sitting in the control room and trying to stay awake. The only sounds were the hum of the engines and the occasional creak of the hull. Then I heard it. A faint tapping. At first I thought it was a trick of the mind, a mix of fatigue and the natural groans of the submarine. But it didn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was tapping Morse code on the hull from the outside. "Do you hear that?" I asked Klaus, the young radio man sitting nearby. He looked up from his station, his brow furrowed. "Hear what?" "The tapping," I said, straining my ears. "It's coming from outside." Klaus listened for a moment, then shrugged. "It's the ice shifting. Happens all the time." But I wasn't so sure. The sound wasn't random. It had a pattern to it, almost like it was trying to communicate. By morning, the tapping had stopped, and I convinced myself Klaus was right. Just the ice. But over the next few days, things got stranger. The tapping returned, louder and more insistent. Some of the men started hearing whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. Of course, there was no wind down here. "It's just your imagination," Victor said when I mentioned it to him. "The cold gets to people, makes them hear things." But it wasn't just me. Kaiser, usually a man of few words, pulled me aside one night. "Müller," he said, his voice low. "You've heard it, haven't you?" "Heard what?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "The tapping, the whispers. There's something out there," he said, his eyes darting nervously to the porthole. "I've worked on these boats for 15 years, and I've never heard anything like it." I nodded slowly, a chill creeping up my spine that had nothing to do with the Arctic cold. The dreams started shortly after. At first they were vague, shadows moving in the dark, figures I couldn't quite see. But they grew clearer with each passing night. I'd see faces pressed against the glass, pale and lifeless, their eyes hollow. They'd watch me, their lips moving silently as if trying to speak. One night, I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The dream had been so vivid. I'd seen one of the figures reach through the hull, its hand impossibly long and thin, its fingers like icicles. It had touched my chest, and I swear I felt the cold burn into my skin. I pulled off my shirt and checked for marks, but there was nothing there. Nothing physical, anyway. The tapping grew louder, more persistent. By now, the whole crew was talking about it, though no one wanted to admit they were scared. Captain Dietrich held a meeting in the mess hall, trying to restore order. "It's just the ice," he said, his voice firm. "We've been through worse. Stick to your duties and we'll get out of this." But his words didn't convince anyone. Even he seemed shaken, though he hid it well. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Men started snapping at each other over the smallest things, and fights broke out more than once. We were trapped, not just by the ice, but by something far more sinister. And then the crack appeared. Kaiser found it during his routine maintenance check. It was in the forward section, near the engine room. A jagged line running along the hull. At first we thought it was damage from the ice, but the edges were too smooth, too precise. It almost looked like it had been carved. "That's impossible," Kaiser muttered, running his fingers over the crack. "The pressure should have split it jagged. This looks like someone cut it with a blade." "A blade?" Victor scoffed. "We're under 50 meters of ice. Who's going to cut into a U-boat?" "I don't know," Kaiser replied, his voice trembling. "But this isn't natural." I stared at the crack, unease settling in my stomach. The tapping sounded louder here, almost as if it were coming from inside the walls. That night, the dreams returned, more vivid than ever. I saw the faces again, but this time, they were clearer. Their skin was translucent, their features warped as if seen through rippling water. One of them pressed its hand against the glass, and I swear I heard it whisper my name. When I woke, the tapping was still there, steady and unrelenting. It wasn't just the ice. It couldn't be. Something was out there, and it wasn't going to let us go. I barely slept after that night. The tapping was relentless, a constant reminder that we were not alone beneath the ice. Every creak of the hull, every groan of the shifting ice above us seemed to echo the pattern. It wasn't random anymore. It felt deliberate, like a message trying to claw its way through the steel walls of the U-boat. "It's Morse code," Klaus muttered one morning, his voice trembling as he sat at his station. His normally steady hands shook as he tapped the pattern on the table. "It's repeating itself, over and over." "What's it saying?" Victor asked, his tone skeptical but tinged with fear. Klaus hesitated, his face pale. "Help us." The room fell silent. Even Captain Dietrich, who had been standing by the navigation table, froze. He exchanged a glance with Victor, and for the first time, I saw doubt in his eyes. "It's nonsense," Dietrich said firmly, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "The ice is shifting, creating patterns. Nothing more. We're soldiers, not children afraid of ghosts." But none of us were convinced, not even Dietrich. The men whispered among themselves when they thought no one was listening, their words filled with speculation and dread. Some believed it was an allied trap, a psychological trick to drive us mad. Others spoke of things better left unsaid. One theory spread like wildfire through the crew, that the tapping was the voice of another U-boat, lost beneath the ice. A ghost ship, its crew long dead but still calling for help. I tried to dismiss it as superstition, but the idea took root in my mind, festering like an infection. A week passed, and the cold seemed to seep into our very bones. The heaters struggled to keep up, and frost began forming on the walls of the compartments. The food was running low, and the mood grew darker with each passing day. Fights broke out over the smallest things, a misplaced wrench, a spilled cup of water. The tension was suffocating. Then we lost our first man. It was Joseph, one of the engineers. He'd been sent to inspect the crack in the hull, which had grown since Kaiser first discovered it. He'd been gone too long, and when Victor went to check on him, he found the compartment empty. Joseph's tools were scattered on the floor, but there was no sign of him. Just nothing. He must have gone to another section, Dietrich said, though his expression was grim. I checked the whole boat, Victor replied. He's not here. We searched for hours, but Joseph was gone. The men were terrified, whispering that he'd been taken by whatever was outside the hull. Dietrich ordered everyone to stay in pairs from that point on, but it did little to ease our fears. The whispers began the next night. Faint at first, like the rustle of wind through trees. But there was no wind here, no trees, just us and the suffocating cold. I was in the crew quarters trying to sleep when I heard them. A soft murmur, indistinct but unmistakably human. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear. The sound seemed to come from the walls, growing louder and clearer. Muller. I froze. The voice had spoken my name as clear as day. My skin prickled with cold sweat as I looked around the darkened room. The others were asleep, their breathing deep and even. No one else had heard it. Muller, it repeated, louder this time. I scrambled out of my bunk and hurried to the control room where Victor and Klaus were on duty. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice shaking. Victor frowned. Hear what? The voice, I said. It said my name. Klaus's face went pale and he exchanged a glance with Victor. You're not the first, he said quietly. Several men have reported hearing things, whispers, voices, names. Why didn't you tell me? I demanded. Because it's not real, Victor snapped. It's stress, isolation. We're all on edge. It's real, Klaus whispered. You know it is. Victor didn't reply, but the look in his eyes said enough. The next day, Kaiser came to me with a discovery. You need to see this, he said, leading me to the engine room. He pointed to the crack in the hull, which had widened further. But it wasn't the size that caught my attention. It was what was inside. Embedded in the crack was something that looked like ice. But it wasn't ice. It shimmered faintly, almost as if it were alive, pulsing with an eerie blue light. What the hell is that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Kaiser shook his head. I don't know, but it's growing, and it's warm. I reached out to touch it, but Kaiser grabbed my wrist. Don't, he said. I tried. It burns. We reported it to Dietrich, who ordered the compartment sealed off, but it didn't matter. That night, the whispers grew louder, echoing through the entire boat. Men covered their ears, shouting at the unseen voices to stop. Some prayed, others cried. No one slept. And then the tapping changed. It wasn't random anymore. It was faster and more urgent, like it was trying to tell us something. Klaus, pale and trembling, sat at his station, decoding the rhythm. It's a warning, he said finally, his voice barely audible. It says, turn back. Turn back to where? Victor demanded. We're trapped. No one had an answer, and deep down, I think we all knew it was already too late. The warning echoed in my mind long after Klaus's trembling voice uttered the words, turn back. But there was no turning back. Trapped under the ice, we were as much prisoners of the Arctic as we were of whatever malevolent force had taken hold of us. The air inside the U-boat grew heavier with each passing hour, not just from the failing oxygen, but from the oppressive presence that now seemed to linger in every corner. The next disappearance came swiftly. Victor was gone by morning. His bunk was empty, his boots still neatly tucked beneath it. He had vanished without a trace, just like Joseph. The men were panicking now, their fear barely contained beneath thin layers of military discipline. Captain Dietrich called an emergency meeting in the control room, his face drawn and haggard. "We will maintain order," he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "This phenomenon is no different than the challenges we faced before. We're soldiers of the Reich. We endure." "Endure what?" shouted Wilhelm, one of the younger crewmen. "We don't even know what's out there. Josef and Victor didn't just vanish. Something took them." "Enough!" Dietrich roared, slamming his fist on the table. The sound reverberated through the cramped room. "We'll search the boat again. No one is to be alone from this moment forward. Do you understand?" Murmurs of agreement filled the room, but the fear in the man's eyes was unmistakable. They didn't believe him, and neither did I. The search yielded nothing. Victor was gone as if he had simply ceased to exist. The whispers continued, louder now, no longer confined to the dead of night. They spoke in languages none of us recognized, a cacophony of voices overlapping and intertwining. And always the tapping persisted, faster and more frenzied, as though the unseen force was growing desperate. Then came the dreams. They began with Kaiser. He woke screaming one night, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "They're under us," he gasped, his wide eyes darting around the room. I saw them, in the ice, faces, watching us. "It's just a dream," I said, though my own voice wavered. "You're exhausted." But he shook his head violently. "Number, it's real. They're waiting." The others began having similar dreams. Men muttered in their sleep, their faces twisted in terror. Some refused to close their eyes, afraid of what they might see. The descriptions were always the same. Figures trapped beneath the ice, their faces pressed against its surface, their eyes unblinking and full of hatred. The breaking point came when we discovered the blood. It was smeared across the engine room floor, a dark, viscous trail leading to the sealed compartment with the crack in the hull. The strange, shimmering substance within the crack had spread, now forming jagged veins that pulsed faintly with blue light. The air in the room was suffused with an unnatural chill, and the sound of the whispers was deafening here, as though they emanated directly from the walls. Dietrich stood before the sealed door, his jaw clenched. "We need to know what's behind there," he said, his voice low but firm. "Are you insane?" Klaus exclaimed. "Opening that door is suicide." "We're already dying," Dietrich replied. "If we don't act, whatever this is will consume us all." The men hesitated, but in the end, fear of the unknown drove us forward. We donned protective gear and forced the door open, the metal groaning in protest. A rush of icy air greeted us, carrying with it a sound that could only be described as a wail, a long, mournful cry that sent shivers down my spine. What we saw defied comprehension. The crack had widened into a gaping hole, revealing a cavern beyond the hull. The walls of the cavern were lined with ice, but within the ice were shapes, human shapes. Hundreds of them, their bodies twisted and frozen in grotesque poses. Their eyes glowed faintly, the same eerie blue as the veins that now snaked through the hull. And they were moving, their faces turning toward us in unison. "Close it!" someone screamed. "Close the door!" But before we could react, the figures began to emerge. The ice cracked and shattered as they clawed their way free, their movements unnaturally fluid despite their frozen appearance. They made no sound, but their eyes burned with a malevolence that spoke volumes. We scrambled back, slamming the door shut just as the first of them reached it. The metal buckled under the force of their blows, and we could hear the tapping again, more frantic than ever. "What the hell are they?" Wilhelm shouted, his voice breaking. "Does it matter?" Dietrich snapped. "We need to get out of here!" Panic overtook the crew. Men shouted over one another, their fear spiraling into chaos. Dietrich tried to regain control, but it was futile. The whispers grew louder, the tapping more insistent. And then, the lights went out. In the darkness, the whispers became a roar. I felt something brush against me, cold and wet, and I recoiled, my heart pounding. A faint blue glow illuminated the control room, and I saw them, The figures from the ice, now inside the U-boat, their forms shimmering with unnatural light. One of them reached for me, its fingers like jagged shards of ice. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Around me, the others were fighting, their shouts mingling with the unearthly sounds of our attackers. "We have to scuttle the boat," Dietrich said, his voice resolute despite the chaos. "It's the only way to stop them." "You're mad," Klaus shouted. "We'll die." "We're already dead if we stay here," Dietrich replied. With no other choice, we made our way to the torpedo room, fighting off the creatures as we went. The walls of the U-boat groaned under the strain, the hull buckling as the blue veins spread like a cancer. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into my very soul. Dietrich activated the scuttling charges, his hands steady despite the chaos. "For the Reich," he said quietly, before pressing the button. The explosion ripped through the U-boat, and for a moment, there was nothing but darkness and silence. Then, the ice above us gave way, and we were swallowed by the freezing waters of the Arctic. I don't know how I survived. When I woke, I was on the surface, clinging to a piece of debris. The U-boat was gone, and so were the creatures. The ice had closed over the wreckage, sealing it forever. As I drifted, the whispers faded, replaced by the howling wind. But I knew they were still there, beneath the ice, waiting for their next victims, and I knew I would never escape the cold. Thanks for watching. What did you think of the story? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories like this.